So we're at Exodus 14:15 today, and I apologize for my lack of enthusiasm in last week's devotion. I recorded it very late at night, and I wasn't feeling well. But such as it is, let's pick up the pieces and move on. We've got to a new section of the Exodus story today. At the end of chapter 13, Israel have left from Egypt, and they will arrive at Mount Sinai in chapter 18. And that journey from Egypt to Sinai will take them about 2.5 months. And by the time we get to chapter 18, we'll be there, and the rest of the book will play out at Mount Sinai. But today we look at the famous parting of the Red Sea, or the parting of the Reed Sea. I'll get to that in a second. So much in here to be commented on. There's too much, unfortunately, so there's a lot that I'm not saying in this video. And my videos have already been too long, so let's get to it. Chapter 14 gives us the details about the Red Sea crossing. Now, as I've already mentioned, there's a translation issue. It's either Red Sea or it's the Sea of Reeds. You probably noticed that in your own translation. Chapter 13, verse 18 tells us about that issue. Now, it's important to note that given the location details that are spelled out in chapter 13, verse 20 and chapter 14, verse 2, so there's some cities that are named there and some locations that are named, that infer that this probably isn't the Red Sea as the body of water that we know today as the Red Sea. You know, that long, narrow sea that's between Saudi Arabia and Egypt? I don't believe that's the body of water that we're talking about here, given the locations that are mentioned in this story. This body of water that we have here is much more likely a really large tidal lake somewhere up near the modern day Suez Canal. Now, even though it's a lake, it's called a sea, but that wasn't uncommon in the ancient world. The Sea of Galilee, for example, in Israel, was also a lake. That's just the way that ancient people spoke. Anyway, whatever the exact location of this Red Sea or Sea of Reeds, whatever it was a significant enough body of water, so large enough and deep enough that the entire Egyptian army of 600 chariots could drown in it, and that the walls on either side of the Israelites, the water could be called walls. So it's a big body of water, whatever it is. This isn't to downplay the scale of this miracle. Now, why does God do this? Chapter 14, verse 4, God says that he will gain glory through this event, because Pharaoh and all his army and the Egyptians, through this event, they will know that he is Yahweh, that he is the true God. So this is God's final act of judgment on Pharaoh and on Egypt. And God is going to make a mockery of Pharaoh and his army here, so that by it, the name of Yahweh would be known as the one who does not leave the wicked unpunished. It might feel a bit strange that he's going to the extent of making a mockery of his enemies, but the New Testament actually speaks about the cross in the same way. The cross made a public spectacle of the elemental spiritual forces, so that the demons and such. So we find out in this story that Pharaoh is missing having the Israelites as his slaves, so he pulls together a massive party to go and round them up. 600 chariots, we're told, and chariots were the most technologically advanced form of weaponry in the ancient world. And as the Israelites see these 600 chariots approaching, knowing that people can fire arrows or spears from these chariots, they are terrified of them. And we have the first instance of the grumbling of the Israelites in the wilderness, but it certainly won't be the last one. They're going to grumble a lot in the next few chapters. But Moses, in stark contrast, who he once was a fickle man himself back in chapter 3, he stands up and he points the Israelites to God and says, he will deliver us. He says, the Egyptians you see today, you will never see again, because Yahweh will fight for you. You need only to be still. And so God does what he does. The pillar of smoke and fire moves from being in front of Israel to being behind Israel, and it staves off the Egyptians and prevents their attack, while Moses lifts his staff in the air and a strong eastern wind drives the water back to create a path of dry ground for the Israelites to travel across. And they are delivered through the Reed Sea from harm's way. Now, eventually, it says, as morning comes, the Egyptians follow them into the Reed Sea on their chariots, but they become stuck. And then God instructs Moses to raise his staff again, and now the water is going to crash back over them, and not one of the Egyptians will survive, including Pharaoh himself. Despite how the Prince of Egypt tells this story, Pharaoh himself even dies in this catastrophe. And the result of this happening in verse 30 and 31, chapter 14, that day Yahweh saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of Yahweh displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared Yahweh, and they put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. Now, this whole picture of the water and the mess probably reminds you of Genesis chapter 1. Remember Genesis chapter 1, where God brings order out of the watery chaos as the wind of God is over the water. See, here, God is making his people, his covenant people, through whom the whole world will be blessed. He's bringing them through the watery chaos of Egypt. Chapter 15 is the first song that's recorded in Scripture. And the reason that it occurs in chapter 15 is because this is this pattern of deliverance and singing. So there will be this pattern throughout Scripture that will go where the response of God's people to his act of redemption is faith and singing. Faith and singing. Because remember that the people responded to seeing this by fearing the Lord and putting their trust in him. And then they respond, chapter 15, with a song. And Christians, we should do the same. Our response to God's act of deliverance should be faith and singing. Because singing isn't a choice for Christians. Colossians chapter 3, verse 16, Paul says, he commands, let the message of Christ dwell among you richly, as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom, through psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit, singing to God with gratitude in your hearts, he says. Now, singing is a command. It's what we do as Christians. There might be times where we sing songs of lament, but the pattern that's set up here is that we will also sing songs that are filled with faith and praise and jubilation about God's deliverance of us. That's why we sing whenever we gather as a church. Despite what might be going on in the world around us, despite all the terrible things that could be happening, we have been delivered by the exodus of Jesus, and so we have faith and we sing. Now, the song itself that's recorded in chapter 15, it rejoices and points out that God has achieved all that he has set out to achieve in the Exodus story. His name has been associated with love and awe and wonder, strength, unfailing love, as well as judging wickedness. His name is esteemed above all the other gods. Remember, Pharaoh himself was considered a god. So how much more could another god be mocked than to be lying at the bottom of a sea? That's what's happened. And through this event, all the nations of the earth will hear about it. So the people of God sing. And the act of singing is a joyful retelling of what God has done. See, I wonder if the nations would have heard about this event if it wasn't for the people of God responding in jubilant song. And so I wonder if this jubilance and this joy is behind the singing that we do as a church on Sundays. Is our singing a jubilant response to the way that God has saved us? And does our singing translate to joyfully telling others about what God has done? Because the nations don't find out unless we, God's people, draw attention to it. So let's draw attention to it. See ya.